if you're a fan of JJK and Chainsaw Man, then you might have noticed this difference. People who hate on JJK claim that it's pure hype and all it has is great fights, which is a really weird criticism for a battle series. But it's not even true. On top of having amazing fights, JJK also does a great job of handling its characters. And so does Chainsaw Man. However, there's one area where JJK handles them better. That is in the characters' deaths. Chainsaw Man has some great character deaths, but there's something that JJK consistently does that Chainsaw Man still doesn't really do in Part 2. So in this video, I'm going to compare some of the characters' deaths in each series and explain why JJK generally handles them better. Obviously, this will contain major spoilers. Now, naturally, there's a level of subjectivity to this kind of discussion. Whether you're impacted by a character death kinda depends on how you like the character. And that's why I'm focusing on character deaths and not characters in general. If you take 10 fans of both series and ask who has the better characters, it's usually more or less of a toss-up. To account for that, I'm going to focus on the more prominent character deaths. And starting off with JJK, there's probably no death that stands out more than the death of Nobara. And of course, I say death while doing the quotation things with my fingers because obviously there's the possibility she could come back. But it's funny because Twitter exploded when this death happened. Yet I find that you either love the character or you find her to be boring. So it makes you wonder what makes this such a good character death when the character in question isn't necessarily a fan favorite. Well, how much you like a character can be looked at as how attached you are to the character. For the sake of argument, let's say you at least felt some kind of attachment to Nobara. Even if she's not your favorite, she's a friend of Yuji's and she's been in the main trio for a large share of the story. But character attachment is just one element of a character death. A well-executed character death has 5 factors. I would say the first one after attachment is build-up. Build-up is an important factor because it creates tension, keeping us on the edge of our seat and making us expect the death at every turn. For the Nobara death, it was the Mahito fight and the flashback following that fight. The instant she engaged Mahito, one of the most powerful villains at the time, we knew that the worst could happen. Then at the end when he lands an attack and she suddenly gets all peaceful, we get really worried. And the more we get her backstory, the more we just keep thinking, oh god, she's really done for, isn't she? All of this builds up to the actual death, creating tension for readers that enhances the impact. Speaking of which, impact is another element of character deaths, and this takes 2 forms. First, impact on the reader. This is another way of saying how did you feel when you saw that death. Needless to say, even if you don't like Nobara, her death hits pretty hard considering the way it happens. Now the other impact we have to consider is the impact on the story and its characters. Death is a form of loss. So for a death to feel real, it should have consequences such that the story is now changed as a result of that loss. In this case, while there are probably other consequences, the big one is the change in Ouji. Ouji was already on a decline as he lost Junpei to Mahito, then Nanami, and now Nobara. When Nobara dies, that destroys his spirit, such that he doesn't have the will to fight and loses his meaning for fighting. Of course, he finds a new reason to fight when Todo shows up, but we likely wouldn't have had this transformation if it weren't for the death of Nobara. Finally, the last factor in a character death is how it influences their character arc. This is similar to Impact, except for this one we're really focused specifically on this particular character's story. Was their arc wrapped up? How did this death define the character? Were there any unresolved questions? These are the kind of questions we should ask, but they're by no means an exhaustive list. For example, you might ask how a death defines a character, but if a character dies and comes back, then you might want to use other questions as criteria. Nobara is still gone, so at the moment we can consider her death a defining moment, which it is. We get her flashback, which establishes her character development and contextualizes her character arc, and her final goodbye acts as a closure to her character as well as a conclusion to her arc. So, as we can see, analyzing the Nobara death gives us these 5 criteria: attachment to the character, build-up, impact on reader, impact on story, and character arc. And it's the regular satisfaction of these factors that makes so many of the deaths in JJK feel memorable. Now, if you're a Chainsaw Man fan, you're probably pissed off right now because there are a bunch of deaths that satisfy these criteria, and rightfully so. But before I start applying our test to Chainsaw Man to explain why this isn't exactly the case, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, if I say JJK has better character deaths and I point to those 5 criteria, every Chainsaw Man fan should instantly respond by pointing to the death of Aki. Because the death of Aki is not only the best death in Chainsaw Man, but many people would agree that it's one of the best handled deaths in manga. Character attachment? That's a no-brainer. Aki was part of the main trio like Nobara, but he was even more popular. He was voted 3rd favorite character in the first popularity poll, and rose to number 1 in the second poll. So this was a character that a majority of people loved and felt strongly attached to. You also have the fact that there was plenty of build-up for his death. In fact, his death was basically built up to from the moment we found out he was after the Gun Devil. Then you have the death of Himeno, which don't worry, we'll get to later in the video. But her death was a sacrifice and a warning to Aki, which of course he ignored even though it hurt him immensely. Then you have the future devil telling Aki he'll die a terrible death. There was plenty of build-up for this death, more so than we had for Nobara. This is also true when you look at impact. It destroys readers who then have to watch the tragically ironic snowball fight between Aki and Denji. It might not have the shock factor of Nobara's death, but I think it's still more emotional. And it obviously has a huge impact on the story. Because he had to stop Aki, Denji feels responsible for his death. This pushes Denji towards the edge, leading him closer to Makima's full control just as she's planned all along. Finally, this death could not be a more perfect defining moment for Aki's character arc. His whole arc was about his quest for revenge, and how that defined his identity, but his death also defines the tragic element of his character arc. He worked for revenge this whole time, only for it to be one big joke that led to his inevitable death. Plus, in this fight, we see that Aki didn't want revenge all along. All he wanted was family, which is exactly what he loses. These same 5 criteria that we used earlier show just how perfect the Aki death is. And as I've been saying, this death is clearly better than the Nobara one, so it only makes sense that someone would point to this and say that Chainsaw Man clearly has better character deaths, which is a perfectly valid argument, except for one small problem. The Aki death is one of many character deaths in Chainsaw Man. There are a bunch of great deaths like Power, but there's also just as many, probably more to be honest, that are easily forgettable or just don't nearly hit as well. So for example, you could place Aki, Power, Reze even, and probably a few more as like the top tier ones. Below that, someone in the mid tiers, like the death of Himeno, simply for the fact that it's an okay death at best. For example, when you look at the build-up, it's minimal. The death comes out of nowhere and there's no real tension. This is in contrast to the Power death, which also comes out of nowhere, but is built up to by showing Makima lead Denji to the door in a scene that creates an incredible amount of tension in a very brief moment. As far as impact, it absolutely impacted Aki, as well as Denji, who later questioned his humanity as a result. But it doesn't have a huge impact on readers. Himeno dies shortly after she is introduced, so we're not that attached to her, and she dies in a pointless sacrifice, making it so that her death isn't nearly as impactful as the other ones we've discussed. And while this does wrap up Himeno's character, she dies so soon that it leaves her arc as a brief one that should have been longer, given the way she's set up as an important character at this point. All in all, not bad, but definitely not great. And this is one of the mid-tier deaths. There are so many other deaths that just happen out of nowhere with no warning or build-up that lead to a sort of deathflation in Chainsaw Man. It happens so often that it brings down the consistency throughout the story. You have the death of Arai, the death of the Violence Fiend, the death of Beam, Yuchiko and Michiko. Hell, you can even include the Angel Devil. He doesn't die right away, but his death isn't exactly great. Then there's side characters like Fushi and the unnamed female character who died just as quickly as they were introduced. Meanwhile, when we turn back to JJK, this isn't a problem. JJK doesn't have a problem killing characters, and I'm sure there's minor characters that die just as quickly. But for the most part, JJK takes the time to make each character death satisfying. Satisfying in the sense that it meets those criteria and feels like a proper death. You have the death of Jogo, which gave us a great fight against Sukuna and perfectly wrapped up his character arc. You have the death of Mai, which had some nice build-up and led to one of the most iconic character transformations in JJK. You have the death of the principal, Yaga. He was a relatively minor character, but was still given an emotional ending. You even have the death of Junpei, a character we knew for one arc whose death had a major impact on Yuji and is still one of the most tragic in the whole series. This is the critical difference between deaths in JJK and deaths in Chainsaw Man. In Chainsaw Man, you have a handful of incredibly tragic deaths, but they are the few great ones that stand out among the many mediocre ones. Combined, the reader is conditioned to expect death almost all the time, to the point where they can almost laugh every time it happens. In JJK, there's a similar amount of death, but the deaths are regularly more satisfying and each have some kind of serious impact on the story. Because of this, readers are conditioned to understand that death in the story is something very serious, even if it's a staple of the plot. So when they're suspecting that a character might die, there's a real sense of tension as opposed to just casual anticipation, making for better impacts throughout the story and an overall better reading experience in this regard. Chainsaw Man might have your number 3, 2, and 1 favorite deaths, but if I asked you which series handles death better, you'd probably tell me it's JJK. And when you look at the criteria we've discussed and the deaths we've explored, it becomes very clear why JJK can do this better than Chainsaw Man. But maybe you disagree. Maybe you think Chainsaw Man does a better job. Share your thoughts and say what everyone else has to say down below. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another JJK discussion like this one, then check out part 1 of this series. In that video, I explain why Chainsaw Man has better pacing than JJK. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.